Hi, welcome to episode 6 and our final episode in the Positive Mindset series. And I've titled this episode Dangerous Minds because I'm kind of returning us to the scene of the crime. Do you remember that when we started the series, episode 1 was on the nature of the mind? And I sort of joked that if you're going to do a series on positive mindset, you have to be someone who knows a lot about unpositive mindsets. So today, in the interest of addressing some of the deeper challenges of one's mind, I don't want to leave untreated very serious distortions of mind that create harm to ourselves and relationships. And of course, the biggest abyss, the deepest cavern in the mind is the intention to or consideration of ending one's life. And you know, our culture is going through so many changes right now. We have economic dislocation, we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's unemployment, we're having climate crises, families in crisis, and we're kind of having a global healing crisis in a way. So many people are trying to address and heal things that have been either glossed over, suppressed, or ignored before. I was struck recently when I was doing research for this episode by a pretty intense statistic that the number of children in the United States who are attempting suicide, children between the ages of, I believe it was 10 and 17, has tripled in the last 20 years. So this is real, this distress, this inability to cope with or resource oneself through periods of distress and distortions of the mind. I think the trickiest part about the dangers of the mind is that when you're getting ready to do something you're excited about, or when something doesn't work out, we don't have a lot of publicity about dealing with things that don't work out and dealing with disappointment and loss. So I really wanted to take this on head on. And first of all, the first thing I want to say is if you or a loved one are considering something like that, if anyone has voiced that intent, that consideration, that attitude, I would direct them immediately to the National Suicide Crisis Hotline, which is included in the resource section of your course. But also, I interviewed the staff there because I wanted to know, well, what do you do? How do you talk to people like that? Because, the chances are none of us are really prepared when somebody voices something like that. And of course, the first thing we want to do is either deflect or change the subject because it's too distressing. But I was informed that what you really want to do is sort of talk about wow, I really hear you. The first thing you want to do is say, wow, I really hear you. And that's a lot of distress, and I'm really curious about where this is coming from. So you want to indicate interest, not rejection of. Interest in, not rejection of their thoughts. The second thing you want to do is identify ways they're connected to life, even if they feel disconnected. And a lot of times suicide is a voice of disconnection and distress. So you can ask, do you have children? Do you have plans for the weekend? Are you working? How is that? And you can, talk about what your plans are. Do you have goals? So even if they're in quite a negative frame, you can ask those questions, and you can be a caring individual. There's a popular meme on Facebook and other social media about a man who has just offered cups of tea to people on a bridge in Australia who were considering ending their life, and something like 450 people attribute to him saving their life just because he gave them tea and he talked to them. So let's just, go right into that. Suicide is a real crime against the soul. So from a spiritual perspective, it's kind of the deepest loss and the deepest act against life, because life is sacred, life is precious. And oftentimes in our culture, we take so much for granted that we don't say life is sacred, life is precious. The second area I want to address is judgment and shame. Many people reach a point of suicidal ideation because they've experienced so much judgment and so much shame. Now, if you notice, when I'm talking about these aspects of dangerous mind, have you noticed that there's an emotion attached to the attitude? Like the attitude is judgment, self of or others, and the emotion is shame. And, you know, of course, there are times when we judge our own behaviors and those of others because, you know, we're kind of having moral checks and balances and social agreements. I prefer not to be treated like this because you don't want to hurt people. But in some cases, you know, this is just has to be made plain. And the point is, judgment and shame are very paralyzing and inhibiting conditions. So let's say you work in a very judgy, snarky environment. It's very tough. It's very tough. There are bullying tendencies in our schools that have also caused young people to question the meaning or value of their life. So judgment is another poisonous aspect of the mind. I want to name one more, and that is paranoia. Paranoia is like a mental mindset that involves the projection of fear and malice onto others. Like, I think that person is out to get me. And sometimes they are. But most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're not even thinking about anything but getting the next step down the road. But paranoia can really take over your reality and make you lose trust in all your connections. And this too is very alienating. So what do we do with these poisonous abysses of the mind that connect us to prolonged aversive emotional states? Remember back in episode 2 when I talked about the role of spirit and the heart-mind connection. This is one case in which you really, really need to claim yourself as a soul, that as a being of light, a person who's full of light, a person who's full of love, even if the circumstances seem to look differently. And that's the trick, is to look beyond appearances, so that you become, you know, like part of the punchline of the course is to take yourself from a person just wandering through thoughts and feelings that seem to occur out of nowhere to taking oneself in hand and creating consciously these practices that can put you in a positive frame of mind and also can host and show love for the parts of us that seem not positive. And then the third step, which is, it's like a little bit of a mountaintop, right? The third step is that you become a person who hosts light actively and understands yourself as a spiritual being filled with light. And if you repeat a light meditation over periods of weeks, months, years, you will literally recalibrate your cellular structure to reflect that presence or dominion of light so that you still face the slings and arrows of life, but you have this pool of light inside that keeps you in a resilient beam, in a resilient frequency. It's almost like instead of being under an umbrella that blocks out the sun or the rain, you're constantly in a beam of light. And that is our goal in terms of progress up the path. But oftentimes, as we clear out old patterns, old mechanisms, and old emotional responses, just as we begin to make progress, some totally, hairy clawed part of our being will jump up out of nowhere and try and convince us that it's a sham. And believe me, I have walked through these dark alleys, and I went through a period, probably shouldn't say this, but I went through a period of just faithlessness almost, and I'm just so full of spiritual support, and my life has been full of miracles and breakthroughs and amazing and beautiful and uplifting things that would cause even the dullest dullard to know that life is sacred and divine, and life is interconnected. And I had the same kind of extremely skeptical, extremely cynical vein that would come in and just say, it's stupid to do this. It's just stupid to do this. You are trying to make yourself into something you're not. Blah, 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 blah. So it's true, you're making yourself into something you're not. That's the great creative act, right? But these dark voices do come in. So I'm going to give you a creative exercise to do in the piece, but I wanted to name some of these poisonous frames of mind, like judgment, suspicion, cynicism, futility, and suicidal ideation, as places where we really, really are walking through that dark, dark turn of the tunnel. And that's where all these tools really come in handy, because you must know that it's darkest before the dawn. So with that, I will send you on to your creative exercise to deal with your own inner critic, inner gloom and doom forecaster, whatever. But this is our segment on the dangerous mind. So don't think that you are your thoughts. You are not your thoughts. You are not your feelings. You are not even your body so much. You are a soul, and you have these dimensions of expression, and you're cleaning house.